Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first urban seminar presentation of the fall of the year. Really excited that everyone's here. I want to thank Raquel Forrester and Audrey Drainer for helping kind of organize this. The way we're going to do these seminars is we are going to have one of the PhD student urban fellows introduce each speaker, and then the speaker is going to present, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. As this is a interdisciplinary seminar, we're going to leave it up to the preference of each speaker up to take questions as they come or at the end. So today's Vivian is going to be introducing LaRue. I'm super excited that LaRue is here. He's been a mentor of mine for I don't know how long, 15 years or so. And he's a really fantastic scholar. I recommend his book right up here. It's really an amazing look at race and inequality in suburban settings. Looks like we have a great number of attendees, and I'll stop talking so we can give LaRue as much time as possible.
All right. I guess I'll go ahead and make the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Vivian Wang. I am a third-year doctoral student at the School of Global Public Health. My concentration is in public health policy and management. It is truly my pleasure to introduce Dr. R. LaRue Lewis-McCoy, who's an associate professor in the sociology of education program at Steinhardt. He holds a PhD in public policy and sociology from the University of Michigan and a bachelor's degree in sociology from Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Lewis-McCoy's larger research interests include race and racism, gender justice, and community mobilization, with a central line of research that concentrates on educational inequality, particularly focused on the intersecting roles of race, class, and place. His first book, Inequality in the Promised Land: Race, Resources, and Suburban Schooling, examined the experiences of low-income and racial minority families' attempts at accessing school-related resources in an affluent suburb. Dr. Lewis-McCoy is currently co-editing a special issue on suburban inequality for the Russell Sage Foundation Journal of the Social Sciences. He is also developing a national survey of Black suburbs and completing an ethnographic project in Westchester County, New York. I'm very looking forward to learning more from Dr. Lewis-McCoy through his work in our discussion today. Given my interest in better understanding the implication of education as one of the social determinants of health for policies that help shape social services and healthcare delivery services in suburban areas. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Lewis-McCoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. I appreciate the warm introduction, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you all this morning into the afternoon. I hope that what I share today can help us further your consideration of even what the concept of urban is, but particularly emphasizing the role of place and also thinking about the forms of inequality that we encounter. So let me see if I can get my slideshow going. Can y'all see that? They're not? Wonderful, wonderful. So today I'm talking to you about exploring suburban inequality. And one of the first things that I think is important for us to understand is that the concept of suburban is really, really important, but often overlooked in a lot of our scholarship, right? So even here at NYU, we have an urban seminar, We don't have a suburban seminar. We often have classes on urban inequality, but we don't talk about suburban inequality. And for me, this is an area that is near and dear to my heart. In part because if you didn't know, I am Black or African American, and I grew up in the suburbs. In fact, I grew up in Connecticut. And when most people think about Connecticut, they may have grown up in the 80s and they think about things like Who's the Boss, or they think about the affluence that is present in Greenwich, Connecticut, or they think about the multiple ways that affluence operates, and they imagine everything looks like a Leave It to Beaver scene, but the reality is quite different. On your screen here in the background, you see a portrait that was done by Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell is often considered the most classic illustrator of Americana life. And in 1967, he produced this painting, which was entitled, the main title is New Kids in the Neighborhood. The subtitle is Negro in the Suburbs. And I love this image because for many folks, this is how people imagine what suburban inequality looks like. And this is a frame, this is a moment, but recognize that Rockwell is painting this in 1967, which may mean that if in your mind and in your imagination, suburban inequality looks just like this, right? Kind of like that confrontation Rockwell also famously illustrated the Little Rock Nine in school desegregation. There has been decades of progress and decades of movement and an increase in complexity, because the suburbs themselves are often understood through our imagined worlds. When I give talks on suburbs, I often ask people, when you hear suburb, what do you think of? And now, unfortunately, right now, I won't be able to person the chat and talk to you, but I commonly hear, I think of single family homes. I think of white picket fences. I think of the process of suburbanization, and all of those things are true. And the suburbs that you may have in your mind are a portion of the rich landscape of diverse suburban life. Because for many people, a suburb looks like a cookie cutter. It looks like cul-de-sacs that turn into dead ends. It looks like literal hell in some ways. Many folks have told me, folks who have grown up in suburbs, I'll do anything I can to immediately get to the city. In fact, we have a fascination with the city. We have a fascination with the urbane. While early American sociologists often talked about the hazards of the city, the malaise that would occur in urban spaces, suburban spaces, as they emerged, started to be identified as idyllic, as the places in which the American dream was not only planted, but blossomed. It occurred through processes of financial lending. So when we think about the Federal Housing Act and the role of home loans, it allowed a certain set of individuals in American history to gain access to spaces outside of central cities. And by certain individuals in particular, I'm speaking about white Americans in large, those who served in the military, and as many scholars who you are familiar with, including Jacob Faber, have demonstrated, there is a long lineage of unequal access to residential space that forms the contemporary segregation we have today. And I do think suburbs are an important place to think about, but when I think about the suburbs, I don't only think about classical Americana. I don't only think about white Americans. I think about folks like Trayvon Martin. I think about folks like Michael Brown. I think about folks like Corinne Gaines. Now, in 2012, Trayvon Martin found himself assaulted by George Zimmerman, who was a white Latino man who deputized himself as a neighborhood watch around an Orlando suburb in Sanford, Florida. And it was the death of Trayvon Martin in many ways that started to activate what would become later known as the Black Lives Matter movement. I think about, of course, Michael Brown, who found himself crossing the street in Ferguson, a suburb outside the city of St. Louis within St. Louis County, who encountered a police officer who not only physically assaulted, but killed him and left him in broad daylight baking in the August sun. I think about Corinne Gaines, an African-American woman who was a mother who found herself in a confrontation outside of Baltimore, in Randallstown in Baltimore County, in which she ended up in a shootout with police while holding her child, over which was something that began as a traffic stop and escalated to a fatal encounter. See, when we talk about the emergence of things like Black Lives Matter, we often think that these things have happened in central cities, but there is some scholarship that suggests that one is more likely to meet a fatal police encounter in suburban spaces rather than urban spaces or central cities. This points to the notion of threat, This points to the notion of change. This points to the complexity of difference. And the truth of the matter is that Sanford, Ferguson, and Randallstown are all suburbs, but they actually look different. If you were to look up the demography and the demographic portrait of Sanford and Ferguson, you would see Ferguson was a rapidly changing, increasingly African-American suburb, which had an out-migration of white residents and an out-migration of middle income and higher residents. And Sanford looks a little bit different, Randallstown as well. I place these three names, these three images here for you to think about suburban not simply as a singular entity, but to think about the heterogeneity that exists within the category. Now, the idea of suburban is often complicated because for decades we've been told what suburbia looks like. And for many, the image of suburbia is this. So I decided to use my extensive research skills and to Google suburban family. And this is the first hit, and the second hit looks like that, and the third hit, and the fifth, and on down the line. This is your standard stock photo of a white family standing in front of a single family home with a manicured lawn. It fits very neatly into our conception of suburban. When we think about historians like Kenneth Jackson, when they wrote Crabgrass Frontier, they were capturing the ways in which folks had moved out of central cities, sometimes by trolley cars, sometimes via highways, and created plots on former farmland that they privatized, that they curated, that they called together. And so that suburban image has been planted in our mind, so much so it often impacts how we think about who is where and what should be done. Not long ago, in the summer of 2020, Donald Trump said, "I'm happy to inform all the people living their suburban lifestyle dream that you will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhoods." For those of us who are familiar with the concept of dog whistle politics, the suggestion that one can speak in race and class terms without explicitly mentioning race, this is probably a dog whistle, but Trump's entire administration was much more like a bullhorn. And Trump himself understood that the suburbs had diversified, but he was able to use a lingua franca that would suggest, particularly to white Americans, the project of desegregation, the project of actually integrating housing, the project of increasing equity will be stopped under my watch. And it was Trump who insisted in moving from a place of actually using fair housing to emphasizing the notion of community choice. The idea that you could use NIMBYism, not in my backyard, to keep out folks who are non-desirable. Now, we can trace the history of fair housing in suburban spaces, and we would actually find over and over again that not many suburban spaces actually introduce successfully a significant number of low-income folks, right? I'll speak to you a little bit later about a project that I'm doing in Westchester County, which is just north of New York City. But Trump knew full well that people understand suburban as white. And what I want to do today is, from the lens of a social scientist, is trouble this some. Now, I am a sociologist by training, so I'll admit my biases up front. But one of the things that I began to do when I started to think about suburban inequality was to read across disciplines, right? I think that we have to, if you're a sociologist, you have to read economics. If you're an economist, you have to read history. If you're in history, you have to read education, on down the line, right? And what I quickly found was that history had a bit more of a robust conversation about the suburbs. And Andrew Weiss, who wrote Places of Their Own, has a quote that I love that speaks to our understanding, or our limited understanding, of what suburban is. He wrote, "Historians have done a better job of excluding African Americans from the suburbs than even white suburbanites." I want you to think about that for a second. Historians have done a better job of excluding African Americans from the suburbs than even white suburbanites. Now, Weiss, when he wrote this, is suggesting something about the role we as researchers play in framing knowledge and even recreating inequality. And many, if I were to ask folks in this audience for them to name 5 Black suburbs, or 5 suburbs that have a significant Black population, it may be a struggle, because oftentimes, even when Black people are present, they've been made invisible. Or, as we see when we trace the history of suburbs, formerly Black suburban communities are sometimes pushed out via incorporation into white suburbs, via use of eminent domain, as well as as well as uneven development. Black suburban life has been looked over, it has been looked past, and it has been under considered. So my research project is in part about challenging that. I am specifically interested in suburban inequality, but I have a deep tie to understanding the experiences of Black folks within suburbs. That doesn't mean that I don't think about other groups, but I just want to give you the angle from which I approach. Now, when we're talking about a suburb or suburban, I'm going to give you kind of like a distinction for thinking through, right? Because oftentimes when people hear or think about a suburb, they think about something that's outside of the city. Maybe you grew up in Detroit. Maybe you grew up in Los Angeles. Suburbs tend to be located outside. They tend to be a particular place that people go and live. Ooh, let's see if I can get this to advance. It'll catch up. Yeah, there we go. They tend to be a place, a destination that people desire. It is a place where folks can go and they can relax and they can customize their life. It is a geographic space because oftentimes we think about suburbia and we think about commutes. We think about strip shopping malls. We think about destinations that have their own ecology, but are distinct from the central city. And importantly, we think about the process of suburbanization, right? And that is the formal movement of people from central cities and the development of housing stock outside of the city, taking over former farmland that ultimately would lead us to kind of our narrative about inner ring suburbs, which draws from Chicago School's notions of concentric zones, which is not necessarily a perfect way to talk about suburbs, but we have an idea in our head about suburbanization. But what I think is also important is that we carry something in our head that I often refer to as what suburban is, that is much more indexed, not just to place, not just to the process of suburbanization, though it is, but to the idea of what it means to be suburban. So sometimes people can talk about suburban neighborhoods in the center of cities. So we can think about in the summer of 2020, protesters marching through St. Louis and being confronted by white residents who stood outside on their lawn with automatic weapons, in khakis and polos, and were yelling at protesters. And folks were like, look, this is suburban resistance. It was in the center of the city, but because it was a private home and it was private space, it felt suburban. People often think of suburban as something that is homogenous, that there is not heterogeneity or diversity. And sometimes when a community is less diverse, we start to apply the concept of suburban, even if it is geographically located not outside of the boundaries. We also think about places that are manicured, that have an individual aesthetic that people are able to control. They have private driveways, they have lawns, they have they decorate for particular holidays, things that tend to be the opposite of how we imagine what urban or city life is, as well as they've been engineered. That suburban spaces they don't occur by happenstance. They occur by very intentional sets of practices and policies. They are desirable areas. What I think is important for us to hold in our head is that something can be suburban and not in a suburb, or something can be a suburb and not be read as suburban. So in this talk today, I'll talk a little bit about a place outside the city like New Rochelle. I could talk about places that I've studied like Yonkers. You could talk about places like Ferguson. And one of the things that people often say to me is, yeah, I get it, it's outside of the city. Yeah, I get it used to be a suburb, but is it really a suburb? To which I always ask them, well, what classifies a suburb? What makes the thing suburban? And how do we start to disentangle those things for our projects of study? Because this will lead us to thinking about inequality in different ways. Today's talk is going to be framed around a couple of projects that I have going on, some of which are completed, some of which are in process. And my goal is to spark a conversation or to hopefully get you thinking about the role of suburban space. And so the first thing I want you to think about, we know inequality exists, but do the forms of inequality change when we are in suburban space? I also want us to think about the forms of inequality and ask, are there particular types of inequality that may be more prevalent in suburban spaces than they may be in central cities? I also want us to think about, does the kind of suburb matter for the forms of inequality, for the type of compensation we see, to the type of organizing? And I also want us to think about, how do the actors matter? Sometimes we talk about entities like a city or a suburb as if they have a totalizing function. Everyone within them experiences them the same way. I would argue to be Black in a suburb is not the same as to be white in a suburb. To be undocumented in a suburb is very different than someone who's a multi-generational status within a suburb as well, right? It is those different dimensions that we also have to start to spell out so that we can see the degrees of inequity that exist and start to craft policies and interventions that'll get us closer to equity. which is my goal, and maybe you share that goal. And then lastly, I want us to think about the notion of relationships and what we've come to call relational sociology. The idea that people exist in particular spaces and ecologies, and their relationships bear meaning. They shape experience, they shape opportunity, and sometimes you have to look at a thing as it is intact in the interactions between actors to fully understand how that inequality operates. So I'm going to take a turn back to a degree to the book that Jacob mentioned in the introduction, which is Inequality in the Promised Land. And Inequality in the Promised Land is based on a study that I did in a Midwestern suburb, right? And so this was the type of place that was desirable. The pseudonym that I use for the suburb is Rolling Acres, and I use the pseudonym because it's small in size. And based on some of the details that I had, I didn't want the site of study to be uncovered. We can talk about in the Q&A later about why some of my later sites I have not used a pseudonym for. But it was a place of desirable location. It was a place that prided itself on diversity. It was a place that prided itself on making sure that everyone had a place at the table, so to speak. But it had this troubling issue. And at that time, the language that they used to express it was the achievement gap. And people would speak to me and say, LaRue is such a lovely place, and people have these great homes, and there are Black folks with master's degrees in business, et cetera, but there's still this gnawing gap. And so what I did was I used my qualitative skill set, and I did interviews with parents, I did interviews with children, I did interviews with teachers, and I went inside of schools, and I sat in elementary schools, and I observed language arts, and I observed math, and I observed cultural nights, and I also went to the archive. I went to local newspapers, and I went to the reports of the local school district to see how they had dealt with issues of educational inequality so that I could actually get a richer portrait. Because one of the first things that one may recognize when entering into a suburb and talking to folks who are local, one of the first things they tell you is that I know this is a suburb, but we're different, right? Now, of course, I think everyone is different and special in their own ways, but I think it's important to get a grounding on how people understand who they are within a space, as well as who they are relative to other geographic spaces that are around them. So today I want to talk to you about one of our favorite things. It's kind of like this notion of cupcakes, right? And if you grew up in the United States in particular, and maybe even in suburban spaces or urban spaces, you have found that a science fair is a common project that people do where children develop individual science projects. And so I want to talk to you about one of the fundamental things that people desire in education. And we talk about one of the keys to educational success, one of the links to educational achievement is this idea of parental participation. And I'm going to introduce you to a couple folks. I'm going to introduce you to Miss Martin and Miss Tolles, and I'm going to introduce you to a teacher, Mr. Marks. So I first met Miss Martin at River Elementary's open house event. As I floated about the school, I stopped at Mr. Marks' fourth grade classroom to find him positioned with his back to the classroom door, arms crossed and repeating, "I will not discuss this with you. We can set up a time to talk later." After Mr. Marks, a white man, repeated this several times to Miss Martin, an African-American, ultimately, she left his doorway visibly discouraged. I trailed her down the hallway and introduced myself, and I told her I was doing a research project on River Elementary School. She interrupted me to say, "You don't want to talk to me. I don't have good relationships around here." I reassured her that I was interested in all families' experiences, whether good or bad. By the time I met Miss Martin in the hallway, I'd known Mr. Marks for weeks, and he had advised me that there were several families that he thought would be interesting for me to interview as well as observe. The Martin family, interestingly, was not on the recommended list. After my initial conversation with Miss Martin, I returned to Mr. Marks and asked about her and the potential of her being in my study. He shuffled through his papers on his desk. He didn't raise his head, and he informed me, "You can speak to her if you want." Mr. Marks' non-ringing endorsement was more understandable over the course of the school year, where I came to learn that Mr. Marks and Mr. Tyler, the school principal, who was another white man, identified Miss Martin as a, quote, problem parent. This disinterested manner in which Mr. Marks referenced Miss Martin was in stark contrast to his references to Miss Tolles, another African-American mother in the classroom. During that same open house event at River Elementary, where I happened upon Miss Martin, Mr. Marks insisted I meet Miss Tolles. He repeated throughout this evening with excitement, "You have to meet Miss Tolles. She's African-American and a lawyer." A few hours into that evening, Mr. Marks saw Miss Toll's son, Jeffrey. He called him over with excitation and requested that he bring his mother to meet me. Miss Tolles politely accepted my introduction. She said we would talk later, and she returned to her role as a parent volunteer for the open house. Throughout my time in the field, unlike Miss Martin, Miss Tolles was a very engaged parent, but her engagement was rife with race-related hurdles at her son's school, which she negotiated in part because of what Pierre Bourdieu would call habitus. "Your mother knows better," Mr. Marks said. Raven, a quiet and sensitive girl, was saddened by the reprimand and public rebuke of her mother's efforts. Mr. Marks felt justified in yelling at Raven, a small African-American girl, and denying her bringing in of cupcakes to celebrate her birthday. Mr. Marks reminded her, that is Raven, that all baked goods had to enter the room through room parents. Now, room parents are volunteer parents who coordinate the engagement of parents with the classroom. So if by right and by rules, Mr. Marks says that if you want to send in cupcakes for your birthday, you must contact a room parent, the room parent must contact me, and then those cupcakes will be brought to the room parent who will bring it to the room, and then they'll be distributed. Now, Miss Martin the night before had been excited about her daughter's birthday, and Raven had asked for cupcakes, and so she stayed up late and she prepared the cupcakes, and Raven brought the cupcakes in her hand, and Mr. Marks rejected them. It was that day that Raven ended up in tears, and it was that night that Miss Martin came to confront Mr. Marks. Unfortunately, Mr. Marks was not interested in having a conversation. He emphasized to Raven during the school day and to Miss Martin during the evening that they knew the rules, that he would only talk about it at a scheduled appointment time. What this led to over time was I saw Miss Martin's multiple attempts to engage the classroom, multiple attempts to participate, that she was pushed out of that opportunity because she was told that she didn't follow the rules and the routine of the school, that she had violated them by desiring to go on field trips, by cooking baking goods spontaneously. Now, for many folks, this is in part a story about the way in which class functions, because the other parent that I got a chance to meet in the same classroom with Mr. Marks on the same night was Miss Tolles. And Miss Tolles had figured out a way how to participate. But as Mr. Marks had mentioned, she was also a lawyer. She was a public defender. And when I asked her about her experiences, or if she felt that she was a part or an equal part of River Elementary as other families, she had this to say. I was sharing the science fair, and I was the only Black person on the committee. We'd been meeting all along. And the night that we were setting up, there was this lady, a white lady who was on the PTA, who comes into the room, and Mr. Tyler, the school principal, was there. And Mr. Tyler, he really pissed me off. She walks in and she says, "Well, you can't do it like this." And she started rearranging everything we had worked to put together. And Mr. Tyler just rather than saying, "Well, Sheila, these people are on the committee. Ms. Tolles is chairing this evening's program. The committee's already talked about it. This is what I don't think you should be doing this." Instead, Mr. Tyler was like, "Oh yeah, you're right. Let's move this and move these tables." And I was furious. I just walked out of the room because I thought I was going to kill him. Now, maybe I'm a little bit sensitive, but I thought it was, oh, she's Black. She doesn't know what she's doing kind of thing. Because other Black women and I have talked about it. They'll tell you to chair the event, but then they want to micromanage you and tell you how to do it. So yeah, I have experienced that subtle racism, which is why I think a lot of Black parents don't get involved, because they don't like the micromanaging. Tell me how to chair something, leave me alone, and let me do it. Between Miss Martin, who didn't use the proper channels, and Miss Tolles, who used the proper channels but constantly experienced everyday racial hassles via micromanagement, participation and engagement in school was difficult. Over more than a year of study, I found that, in particular, Black families in suburban schools found themselves in two categories. Either in the category of beneficiary, that is, they were regarded by the school as families that should feel like they had received the benefit of being able to enroll in a high-performing school. They eventually acquiesced and said, "Well, I'm glad that I'm enrolling Acres instead of a nearby city where they have fewer resources. So while I don't get what I want to get, it's better than what I could have." There were also families that were consumers, and they engaged in a practice of identifying what they desired and using exit as a threat. That is to say, they would say, "I want my child to be in this class. I want my child to have this teacher. And if they are unable to do that, then I will leave. Particularly white parents were able to be consumers and maintain their status in the local public school. African-American parents, when they use the threat of exit, were encouraged to leave. So we can talk in the Q&A a little bit about how suburban schools tend to function and the ways in which they prioritize and center the experience of white families. We can talk a little bit more about the role of class as well, because in suburban schools and in suburban places where there's a higher amount of diversity, one of the forms of inequality that Charles Tilly first named, opportunity hoarding, I would argue tends to be more prevalent. When there is a valuable resource, a resource that can be monopolized, a resource that can be hoarded and circled around, it happens in these kind of suburbs. And Black families, poor families tend to be locked out of opportunity. The next thing I want to talk to you is taking you out of the Midwest and bringing you a little bit closer to home, or maybe not your home, just where you're located at now. There's an ongoing project that I've been doing and working on in Westchester County, which is a county just to the north of New York City. It is a very diverse county. It contains one of the first suburbs in the United States, which is Yonkers. And this work I've been assisted with by two talented doctoral students at NYU. I want to shout out Pamela D'Andrea Martinez, as well as Amy Wilson. Pamela's helped with doing some interviews and data coding, and Amy's helped with organizing some of the archival dimensions. And what I was interested in particular is understanding not just what happens in schools, but what happens in communities. So as a sociologist and as somebody who specializes in the sociology of education, we can tend to become very concentrated on the mechanisms within a school, but schools are nested within communities. And I wanted to do something that captured not only schools, but communities in the response. So what this meant, see if we can get this to advance, there we go. Sorry, technology is playing me. What this meant is that I studied Yonkers and New Rochelle. Let's see if I can get this to advance. So there we go, which are two different suburb types. Yonkers is probably classified as more as an inner ring suburb, one of the first suburbs to develop, one that's higher in poverty, one that has more folks of color, but it also has a very diverse landscape, from apartment buildings that are densely populated to single family homes that are spread apart, as well as it has an interesting division geographically, which is divided by highways. It was also one of the first, it has the unique history of being a municipality that lost a housing and school desegregation case basically at the same time. And New Rochelle, which is much more of a bedroom suburb, which tends to be more affluent, but has a long-standing history of having a Black presence. That Black presence in part was originally tied to domestic labor and to white families, but has evolved over time. And so what I did was I developed community-based samples. So looked in communities and tried to make sure to keep the relationship dimension and to do some partnerships. So part of this work is I partnered with Community Voices Heard, which is a housing advocacy group in Westchester County, but throughout New York State, as well as I did observation of local civic groups, as well as did work on newspapers and archives, as well as interviews and participant observation, right? First thing, one of the reasons that I came to this is that I think it's important that we understand that these are not the same old suburbs. So we may have an image of homogeneous, affluent, predominantly white spaces, but the suburbs have diversified. We actually find suburban spaces tend to have greater social class diversity, race, ethnicity, and citizenship than often central cities and definitely rural places. We have seen from some of the literature by Kneebone and Gar that the suburbanization of poverty, that in the last 20 years, more poor people have been located in suburban spaces than central cities. And to this day, the estimates suggest that there are now more poor people living in the suburbs than central cities, which I'll speak about a little bit later in terms of thinking about access to organization and supports. We also know now that the majority of Black residents live in suburban spaces and not in central city spaces. So if in particular you're interested in the experiences of Black residents, in the interests of immigrants, in the interests of students of color, the majority of them are located in the suburbs now. So that brought me to studying a bit more about Westchester County. And one of the things that happens, as many of you all will understand, is that the field shifts and you're impacted by the field. And while I was doing a study purely about how people were thinking about school and how they were thinking about incorporation and how they were thinking about having their voices heard, the pandemic occurred. And that pandemic, when it first hit, New Rochelle was regarded as ground zero of COVID-19. And so on February 27th of 2020, Larry Garbuz of New Rochelle fell ill. On March 1st, he was diagnosed with COVID-19, a novel form of coronavirus, and hospitalized. Prior to showing signs, he traveled around New Rochelle in the New York City area. On his daily commute, he came in contact with people at his job, in the city, and members of his faith community in neighboring suburbs. But mainly, he stayed on the affluent white side of New Rochelle. Upon his diagnosis, Garbuz's faith community was quarantined, and he was called a, quote, super spreader. The choice to call the area in New Rochelle a containment zone carried weight. Containment zone sounds like military terminology or a response to an environmental disaster. Declarations that the National Guard was on the ground conjured images of movies about contagions and the apocalypse. What the containment zone was in reality was very different. When it was established, the containment zone did not mean people could not travel in and out of the zone. It simply meant the banning of large gatherings such as religious convenings and the closing of schools, and an influx of resources like a drive-through testing and contact tracing. So this is a drive-through testing site here. Now, New Rochelle in many ways is special because they were the first to get these resources that we would later see were necessary everywhere. The containment zone didn't cover all of New Rochelle. Instead, it covered just 1 mile, some of the most affluent and whitest portions of the city. By most casual accounts, New Rochelle is integrated, but in reality, it remains segregated. Segregation in suburbs like New Rochelle cuts deep across housing, school, health, work, and friendships. Still, segregation is not impermeable. There are porous boundaries that mark contemporary segregation. In New Rochelle and places like it, people in different stations in life cross paths and even for a moment cross-pollinate, but full integration remains elusive. The containment zone intervention acknowledged the spatial realities of segregation, but therein lies the danger. In drawing the boundary, it assumed we should be who should be in and who should be out and what was needed. It flooded one part of the town with resources while leaving out the needs and the voices on the other side of town. It raised the question for me, what's the line between acknowledging segregation and banking on it to contain a pandemic? Whose voices are heard when there is a crisis, and what happens when multiple crises befall a city? So at the beginning of the pandemic, as they formed this containment zone, they literally essentially formed it around the white part of town. They drew the boundary to the containment zone right in front of what was a historically Black community. And when people raised the concern and said, hey, look, the containment zone probably should be expanded and poor people are probably going to be more vulnerable to this, they were rebuffed. They were rebuffed by the city leadership. They were rebuffed by the federal government. They said, you know, the containment zone and the National Guard would help out. The National Guard would deliver some meals into the Black community to support, but nothing that was actually a mitigation strategy for Black residents in town. They relied on this notion of segregation because they thought that if Garbuz had only been in a certain section of town, that he wouldn't have crossed into other sites of town. And what ultimately happened was there was a flooding of resources into the most affluent sections of New Rochelle. And quickly, they actually got the counts around coronavirus down. Now, alternatively, they intentionally neglected other sections in the city where Black residents and Latinx residents tended to be, right? So in zip code terms, that's 10801 and 10805, right? And some 2 months after its initial arrival in New Rochelle, the city reported the highest concentration of cases in Black and Latinx residents in zip codes of 1801 and 1805. Communities where 15% and 9% of the residents lived below the poverty line, while most white and affluent areas had the lowest rate. The containment zone had done as it was intended. It pushed an array of resources into a highly affected community and one that was racially and economically segregated. But it didn't actually stop Black communities and brown communities being impacted from the coronavirus. As I was starting to think about the role of COVID-19 in impacting the community, I also was quickly alerted that many of the problems I've been studying for the past 2 years remained. The day before New Rochelle, the New Rochelle containment zone was created, many people were huddled at home and concerned about what would happen. But early on that morning, men marked with police jackets entered a residential building, traveled door to door, and asked residents who were mostly Latinx for ID as part of an investigation. As they moved through a 10-unit building in area zip code 10805, they arrested a resident in front of his wife and children. They were not police, they were immigration and customs enforcement, ICE. Now, ICE for years had sent chills throughout the community. New Rochelle is not a sanctuary city. There's been ongoing discussion about making New Rochelle a sanctuary city. But the mayor says that the local police will not serve as immigration enforcement, with one notable exception. They'll work with federal agency on people's cases that have criminal records. Those kinds of exceptions matter, which is why many folks don't actually know about the raid that happened in New Rochelle. As people buckled down for the containment zone, as Latinx residents started to literally try to get people to be aware, hey, there are immigration raids happening, it fell on deaf ears. When they went back to the mayor, they were rebuffed. When they tried to go to other residents and said, yes, COVID is happening, but now they're actually making incursions in our liberal community, nothing was heard of, right? In places like New Rochelle that aren't central cities, people don't often think about immigration enforcement, but this is also a place, these are also the kind of experiences that folks face every day. In the summer of 2020, we had the death, of course, of George Floyd, right? And Derek Chauvin literally kneeled on Floyd's neck. And the world watched, and on June 3rd, a historic crowd of thousands gathered in New Rochelle to actually protest the death of George Floyd and to raise the banner of Black Lives Matter. And then just 2 days later, on June 5th, New Rochelle police killed Kamal Flowers, a Black man, after a traffic stop turned into a foot pursuit. And what happened in this case was, again, folks started to talk about COVID, and the Black community said, well, wait, we just literally had this police killing 2 days after we marched. And the local city government, there ended up being a challenge between how activists on the ground saw the issue. They said, listen, we need to make sure that there's a statewide investigation. The New Rochelle police can't investigate themselves, so find that they did nothing wrong. And what happened over the course of the next 6 months was Kamal Flowers' name never raised to the level of national prominence. In fact, most folks don't know that he was killed. And while activists called for an investigation and the mayor called for a state investigation, what the state was able to do was to decline the investigation and emphasize that they were placing more resources into the community now because of COVID. I speak about these two different things because police encounters, ICE encounters are everyday things that folks in suburban space actually face, but they are not talked about. We think about central cities, and then when you add in the pandemic of COVID-19, these communities feel strategically and structurally left out in the cold. This has led me to another leg of research and a set of questions that I'm interested in pursuing, and I'm doing so with Kimberly Johnson, who's in social and cultural analysis and politics, and a doctoral candidate in sociology, Kira Dowds, which is looking at the state of the Black suburbs, right? So we think about suburban states as often historically and predominantly white, but there are Black suburbs, and the number of Black suburbs has been increasing. The proportion of Black suburbs has been increasing. Now, what we are doing, and this is done in part with the support of IHDSC, who's helping us develop our request for larger funding, is that we want to do a multi-sided and interdisciplinary study that uses surveys and interviews to really get an understanding of how Black suburbs govern. In particular, we're thinking about Black suburbs as suburbs that have a concentration of 25% African-American or higher, right? So that's on average about double the rate of African-Americans nationally, but it's also that place where folks have talked about the idea of tipping around governance. And so we're looking at things like budgeting, education, criminal justice, community mobility. And I'm going to show a slide in a second that may be hard to read, and I get it. I know y'all love slides and a lot of stuff. I'm doing more talking than quant data today. But this is a slide that we're working through where we're trying to get people to understand the heterogeneity of Black suburbs, right? So if you look at the top, you see that the number of Black suburbs has been increasing, and you see that its percentage share has been increasing. And many times when people think about Black suburbs, they literally think that Black suburbs, of course, that's how poverty spills over the line from the city into the first inner ring suburbs. But we actually find that the relationship between Black suburbs and socioeconomic status is not nearly as strong as people think. In fact, there are some very, very affluent Black suburbs and very, very poor Black suburbs. So some of the conversation that has emerged around poverty in the suburbs has assumed in particular that white residents are poor in particular places and Black residents are poor in other places, but there's been less consideration of the heterogeneity and the different types of suburbs that exist. We also have assumed oftentimes that Black suburbs tend to be older places. They're the suburbs that white residents have abandoned and left behind. But the truth of the matter is when you start to look at the structure, when structures were built, we actually find there's some pretty new Black suburban developments and some pretty old ones. All that to say that Black suburbs are increasing in share, and they're part of the narrative that we have to understand. Who's in charge and why? So you can have a suburb that has a significant Black population, but its governance structure may literally remain white. So we see this often in places like Long Island. We see this in places like the Midwest. You may also have Black suburban spaces that tend to be affluent, that have a history of using zoning and other tools to control who enters and exits. And we want to get a deeper sense of understanding what is there, because most times people don't know Black suburbs exist. And when they do exist, they assume they've got to be poor. They've got to be. And so these notions, these ideas of what a Black suburb may be, harken back to me in many ways to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois, when talking about the question of the Negro problem, right? He's like, well, one, it's not a singular thing. It's a tangle of problems. And these problems are often tied to the ways in which white power structures have shaped where people live and where they don't live. And so we're interested in getting a greater understanding of the players who are and the actors who impact the experiences of folks in Black suburban spaces. And we hope that folks will use that data to come as we make it able to be paired with some educational data in other spaces. The last piece that I'm going to talk about today before we go to questions, if I can get it to move, cool. Myself and Natasha Wariku, who's at Tufts, and Stephen Matthews, who's at Penn State, are doing a double issue for the Russell Sage Foundation Journal on Social Sciences. And what we have done is we've brought together an interdisciplinary set of scholars to try to look at suburban inequality. I mentioned earlier on that historians were probably among the first folks to return to studying suburban inequality. Now, there is a history of a literature on the suburbs that emerges, particularly when suburbanization is early on, but sociologists and economists and many folks literally stopped studying what's happening in the suburbs. And even as Herbert Gans has said, there's this sociological amnesia. Some of the things that we began to understand in the earlier phases of suburbanization got washed away. So when people talk about suburbs, they only cite that earlier literature to make their point that they're homogenous, when in fact, most of that literature doesn't suggest that. So we want to make sure to capture what's happening in suburbs, how they're changing demographically and socially. We want to make sure to talk about the different kinds of school environments that folks are encountering, right? And so we have conversations in the volumes talking about not only opportunity hoarding within schools, but the patterns of segregation that exist between different districts, the ways in which different suburban districts have sometimes moved to remove themselves or to splinter off to maintain whiteness. We also have a set of conversations about the role of organization. So I mentioned earlier that now the majority of poor residents in the United States more live in suburbs and in central cities, which means if we're thinking about service delivery, access to food, access to social supports, oftentimes those have been set up in the center of cities, and people who are now located in suburban spaces, it's more difficult to get to. Also, many built suburbs were designed for folks to use a car to get around. Now, if you are using public transportation and have limited routes, it impacts one's ability to work, to access organizations, et cetera. In this piece, in this double issue, we're also talking about the role of politics. So I mentioned earlier, there was a conversation around Trump suggested that suburban life would be restored. But we also see from some of the data that came from the most recent election that the suburbs look very different than what people often talk about, and even the New York Times reports. And we speak in particular about the role of policing. So there is some, we work through this question of whether more Black folks are killed in suburban spaces, or if that may not actually be accurate. And our goal is really to plot a path forward. And we have to plot a path forward because if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves using mythology and misinformation to advance narratives about the suburbs and even advance narratives about justice that are inaccurate. So my congressperson, my representative here in the Bronx is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And in 2020, when there was a conversation about defunding the police on her Instagram, somebody asked, what does defunded police look like? And I'll read to you what Ocasio-Cortez says. She said, the good news is it actually doesn't take a ton of imagination. It looks like a suburb. Affluent white communities already live in a world where they choose to fund youth, health, housing, etc., more than they fund police. These communities have lower crime rates, not because they have more police, but because they have more resources to support healthy society in a way that reduces crime. When a teenager or preteen does something harmful in a suburb, I say teen because this is often where lifelong carceral cycle begins for Black and brown communities. White communities bend over backwards to find alternatives to incarceration for their loved ones to, quote, protect their future, like community service or rehab restorative measures. Why don't we treat Black and brown people the same way? Why doesn't the criminal system care about Black teens' futures the way they care about white teens' futures? Why doesn't the news use Black people's graduation or family photos and stories the way they do when they cover white people, e.g. Brock Turner, who committed harmful crimes? Affluent white suburbs also design their own lives so that they walk through the world without having much interruption or interaction with the police at all, aside from community events and speeding tickets, and many of these communities try to reduce those too. Just starting there would be dramatically and radically different world than what we are experiencing now. So I think Ocasio-Cortez in some ways is onto something, but I think she also dangerously misstates something. She makes the suburbs a white space. She makes suburban reality largely based on the experience of white folks. Now, it particularly challenges me because I know that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for some time lived in a suburban community, and her experience as a non-white person didn't look like her neighbors. And we know in places everything from the 2015 Justice Report to more recent scholarship on pocketbook policing that residents of color are exposed to differential police exposure and receive more fines and fees than their white counterparts. We know that oftentimes this notion of the private and the public, white suburban residents are able to rely on the public, while as Black and Latinx suburban residents are forced to have all of their problems actually worked out in the public without that same kind of private resource. And we also know that oftentimes when we're thinking about policies that intervene on things like poverty, policies that intervene on school inequity, policies that intervene on police encounters, they've been set around the city center and not necessarily the ways that suburban geography can actually impact us. Because the concept of hazard as a minoritized population in the suburbs is a complicated one that too few of us have explored. So with that being said, some concluding thoughts, more like concluding questions, and I look forward to a conversation. What do we lose because we assume? So much of our understanding of suburban space has not been based on empirical study. It's simply been assumed that suburbs work better, look better, and treat people better. The more you dig into that, you see that that's not the case for everyone, and that it's the relationship and the emergence of the suburbs as a racial project should be absolutely considered in our deification or demonization of the suburbs. 2, who's included in our view of the suburbs and who was excluded? What does it mean to only be able to talk about the suburbs and think about white residents? What about the experiences of Asian American residents? What about the interactions between Asian American folks and Black folks in the South in establishing suburban space and community, right? There are a lot of gaps in what we know and what we don't know. And what have we missed in our choice not to study the suburbs? We have class after class and book after book on urban space. And thankfully, more recently, folks like Mario Small and others have troubled this notion of a universal urban. What would it mean to trouble the notion of a universal suburban and start to get at some of the more complexity? And what tools may we need to use to actually capture the suburbs as they are, not simply as we imagine them? So with that being said, questions?
Thank you so much, Lura. That was really amazing. If you have a question for LaRue, please use the raise hand function or type your question in the chat, and let LaRue call on people at his discretion. I'm going to take advantage of the moderator's prerogative here and ask the first question, which is about this thread that is running throughout the talk about, which you crystallized at the end about the suburbs as a racial project. And if we look back across the 20th century, we see this really strong reciprocal relationship between the development of the suburbs as a space and a concept and the consolidation of the contemporary white identity, which David Roediger and others argue, happened in large part because of the suburbs. You had Irish, Italian, Jewish immigrants migrating to these predominantly white but ethnically diverse suburban places, and then this emergence of this narrative of the suburbs as you laid it out. This, the white family, single kind of unit, detached home. And I'm curious what you think is going to happen going forward from now, and kind of what role do you think the suburbs will play in whether or how our definitions of race and categories of race might shift as the United States loses a white majority, or maybe it doesn't.
Great question, Jacob. Not an easy one. And if I were unfair, I would be like, you answer it, Jacob, because you know this very well. So I will say one way to think about it is
no softballs this year in the urban seminar.
Clearly,
yeah.
No softballs. We just, Jacob DeGrom fastballs in here. I appreciate it. One way to think about it is we can think about the process of suburbanization and the process of racialization and the creation of whiteness as parallel, right? So we know that whiteness itself is often regarded as invisible. That is, those who contain a white identity, when asked about if they are white or which identities matter, white is not the first one, nor do they often argue it's a coherent identity. But in reality, we know around a basis of power, it certainly is an identity category in a group, even if they deny it. In a similar way, but a not fully similar way, suburbanization also is kind of like that invisible, omitted normative category that folks haven't interrogated. So what folks started to do, particularly in the 1990s forward around interrogating whiteness and white identity, they should equally be doing around suburban space, right? So you pick your survey, you pick your region, you can pick a white suburb that is doing well, and then people turn and look at places that are less white, less rich, more closer to the city, and they say, what's wrong with them, right? Never interrogating, why has this group accumulated a disproportionate share of resources and opportunity? So we see this in kind of our contemporary work, where in social sciences, we don't tend to think about race mattering until it's discrimination against a non-white person. Race matters when it's actually moving white folks up the ladder. So those suburban spaces that are now the suburban spaces that maintain whiteness, I'm like, oh, I really want to dig into those. How were you able to maintain that, and at what cost, right? And to which degree do you understand your exclusionary practices to be part of an alignment with white identity? Because there's some places in the South that are literally seceding. And while on their face, they suggest that it's not about race, there is a place in sets of conversations where white Southerners are saying, like, no, we are different than those people, right? We can equally think about how spaces that have transition and demographic composition, how much we think people are allowed to have power within them. So one may move to the suburbs that historically you were excluded from, but upon arrival, as I spoke about earlier, this notion of being a beneficiary, right? You are told, like, well, we let you be here so you don't get to call the shots. Whereas suburban history has been about calling the shots, right? So how do we think about the role of power and customization and the inability to customize? But also, how do we think about the role of governance? Part of that tale of suburbanization had a concentration of white resources and dollars that allowed suburban communities to stay afloat. What happens when that tax base diminishes? What happens when people age in place? What happens when folks are no longer willing to pass that bond, right? And people inherit the consequences of what was functionally a niche project. So I think many of those things can be explored, and they're intimately tied. When I talk about suburbanization, I think about it as a racial project, but I also want to hold space for, in particular, those non-white suburban spaces that have maintained. We can also talk about the non-white ones that were wiped out, right? But those that have maintained and have kind of like established themselves even in the midst of an aggressive racial project. Oh, yes. All right. Sorry. Joycelyn?
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk this morning. I this afternoon as well. I really appreciate that we're starting our urban seminar with a discussion of suburbs, because it's something that came up in our sort of initial conversation we were having last week about how do we define urban. You know, what are the parameters that we're setting for ourselves when we're entering into this year of discussion and reflection. One of the things that sort of kept coming back to me as you were speaking, and also in reading the couple of pieces that you sent ahead of time, was also sort of disentangling this notion of what do we consider diversity or homogeneity, because I'm thinking of suburbs in New Jersey, for example, that are touted as very diverse places, and usually that means they're racially diverse. I don't actually know what the sort of breakdown percentage-wise of different racial or ethnic groups is, but they're also very homogenous in terms of class, right? So, you know, when you're thinking about how to understand the heterogeneity of suburban spaces, there's so much to unpack there. And I'm just kind of curious, when you're approaching a multi-site project like the one that you're in the process of developing now, sort of how do you grapple with those, you know, the multifaceted nature of diversity, and also the fact that even within a quote unquote diverse space, like segregation means that things are not actually integrated. People might be within one boundary, but there are smaller boundaries, smaller geographies within those smaller neighborhoods or pockets that are not diverse. So yeah, sorry, it's not a very well-formed question, but these are kind of thoughts that were percolating as you were giving your talk.
No, that's great. I think it's a great question. So your question makes me think about a couple things. Number one, when people think about diversity, they imagine what that thing is and they hold it up as an ideal, right? When people think about what a good integrated neighborhood is, they're also typically holding something in their mind, but they're not tending to all the elements of class, right? They may not explicitly be, but certainly subconsciously they are. So there's a district that I've been writing about, district in Ohio where Kelly Williams-Bowler was arrested for stealing school. You may have heard of the mother jail for stealing school, who had crossed the line from Akron and had sent her child to a suburban school district. One of the things about that district that is unique is that Ohio has this open enrollment school policy, right? So you can opt in, and if you do, anyone can come to whichever school. The municipality that Williams-Bowler was in is like one of a minority of districts that does not do open enrollment. Now, nearly all the districts around it do. Now, what they have done though in this district is they have almost like literally perfect diversity. What do I mean? It looks like the national distribution ethnically, and so people are like, this is a great place, but it doesn't look like the national distribution around poverty, right? And so when Kelly Williams-Bowler sends her children to these schools, right, folks are like, whoa, okay, all right, she's Black, but she's poor, right? Like we love Black people who fit our class status, right? Part of the narrative around suburban space, when people are, when you talk to residents about practices of discrimination, they're like, no, we don't discriminate. Anyone who can afford to live here can live here, as if that is not a process of discrimination. Now we can talk about kind of like notions of protected classes, but built in is this idea that if I can have class homogeneity and racial diversity, great, right? So I think in part that the dimension of the diversity ideology, I think about Kira Dowd's recent piece on how folks are thinking about diversity and how they're crafting it. I also think about the work of Nadira Farah-Foley, who looks at low-income students in a place that prides itself on diversity and their inability and unwillingness to grapple with class questions, right? To operate in forms of silence, to understand class, and how race becomes easier to talk about than class does. So I think as long as we keep a sensitive eye, then we get to interrogate those things in real ways, because sometimes we're operating out of a binary. It's like diverse, not diverse. I'm like, what does diverse mean again? For whom, with whom? What does incorporation look like? It's the same reason I've been, and many scholars have been troubled by the notion of integration. I'm like, what into what? Into who? And how do we measure it?
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, Vivian.
Thank you so much for many great insights. Trying to form my question because, like what Jocelyn said, there's a lot to unpack. But I wanted to kind of go along with what you just mentioned about the protecting the role of class, and if you could elaborate more on maybe even like the example you mentioned about opportunity hoarding early on, and if there has been some change over time or even in the particular neighborhoods that have evolved to something that we can be more optimistic about moving forward.
That is a very fair question, Vivian. If you ever end up in one of my classes, nearly every class ends the same. And they were like, yo, this world is really messed up. Where's the hope? And I'm like, all right, here's where the hope lies, right? And I believe any kind of work towards justice is iterative and it is a constant process. You don't achieve equity, you don't achieve justice. So I can't point to the places where it works totally, because constantly we're gonna fight back against it, right? So speaking about this notion of opportunity hoarding, right? So Tilly posits it as one form of inequality. And I think he underplays the role of ideology, particularly within the United States. American ideology in the 21st century centers around opportunity hoarding. We teach ourselves, we teach our children, we literally rely on it as a mechanism of sorting, of logic, of whom we date, what we major in, etc. Right? I'm like, it's undergirding everything. And because it's that robust, that means fights for equity have to be that more multi-layered, right? And that more proactive. So in New Rochelle, I'll give an example of what that looks like in real time. There are two groups that I've been kind of in conversation with and following, one of which is New Roar, which is a progressive multiracial coalition of folks. It gets established after Trump gets elected, and in part kind of comes out, if you're familiar with political organizing, it derives in some ways from indivisible, right? And what they do is they look at the local ecology of New Rochelle, they look at the local history, and they say, all right, what matters? Who's not being heard? And how do we get our voice heard from the city council to the mayor to the school board? They have literally activated to stop construction of new developments when there was when they found bones, and they were like, we actually have evidence that this used to be an African burial ground, and like they were able to block the construction, right? Now, literally, the folks in town were like, no, just build the building because more people will come. And they were like, no, let's hold. They have also, New Roar, another group that is broken off of that is kind of like, they call themselves a collective. It's a collective of predominantly African-American members of color who are centering on educational inequity. And so they looked at the hiring of they had a superintendent that was hired who was dismissed from New York City, who had a multi-million-dollar reverse discrimination case against the city, who said, I was fired for being white. And the collective immediately sprung into action and said, well, how can we actually call ourselves a community that is diverse and inclusive? And this person literally, one, believes in the concept of reverse discrimination and has demonstrated that they're willing to like reject the leadership of folks of color, right? And so they activated, they organized. And on the other side, there were a number of white parents who were like, no, this is the perfect choice, right? They're going to bring prestige back to the set of schools, right? But it was that organizing that pushed back against this idea of she'd be in leadership. And ultimately, they were able to get her to resign, right? And so that led to the placement of another superintendent and they're being incorporated into the cycle. But we'll talk more about that later, Vivian. Oh, cool, we have more time. Sorry, Jacob, I misread your message. Nadira?
Thank you for a fascinating talk, as always. So one of the questions I was going to ask Vivian kind of beat me to, so I'm glad that I already got to hear you talk a little bit more about kind of how we think about class in these suburban contexts. The other thing that I just was really fascinated by was, getting to hear more about your more recent project, and particularly sort of the fortuitousness of you kind of already being in the field when COVID hit. I think that's just so rich. And I would just love to hear you talk a bit more about what you think we sort of as a society or as a larger collective might have missed by how we framed sort of the COVID story and kind of where was most impacted, and what you think a more suburban angle would have illuminated for us.
That's a good question. Just I want to point out, Nadira Farafoli is one of the people that I shouted out earlier, who has like a great class analysis based particularly in schools and navigation of race. So feel free to email Nadira and ask all the questions about class in the suburbs that you want. All right, so with that being said, if I were to think about a more suburban, considerate conversation around COVID, it would even start with kind of like the notion of drive-through testing, right? So when they poured resources into New Rochelle, they were like, listen, we have these new pop-up drive-through sites. And I was like, well, what about the residents who don't have cars? A significant number of poor residents don't have cars. And your hospitals are currently kind of overrun. There's literally no place for them to get tested. Are they supposed to like walk through drive-through testing like it's a drive-through? No answer, right? I think about these questions of even the class-based dimensions of labor in suburban space, right? So in the shorter piece that I wrote with Pamela D'Andrea Martinez, we talk about a family, the Almazan family, who had been feeding folks in New Rochelle for decades, right? And in the midst of COVID, both the two generations of folks who were in leadership of the restaurant died due to COVID, right? And kind of like how there's this way in which in the emergence of COVID, there was a celebration of essential workers, right? But not necessarily an acknowledgement of the kinds of labor that weren't hospital-based. So folks around New York, including New Rochelle, would bang pots and pans for the shift change, right? But they wouldn't bang pots and pans for their delivery workers. And so when their delivery workers got sick, it's like, oh, too bad, so sad. Like, what are the kind of protections that would need to be in place for daily workers, for folks who make this private, this individual home and health and safety like possible? Because many folks, their escape from COVID was to turn inward into their home. So they had to have stable housing, and then they had things brought in, whether it was Instacart, whether it was Seamless, et cetera. But there's no conversation about those residents who live in the same places, who literally cross over, who contracted the virus and had limited way to not be in harm's way. So so I think those are kind of some of the experiential dimensions. I also think very early on, this use of the containment zone, while one could argue, well, they didn't know how it spread, right? They didn't know how it spread, so a containment zone made sense. I'm like, yes, but we often make assumptions about segregation and how strict it is, right? And their argument was like, in particular, he's part of a religious community. He didn't go here, here, and here. I was like, but you don't know who is going into these folks' houses from different communities. The establishment of the Black community in New Rochelle was tied to domestic labor and service, right? And so even when you have a concentration of cases in a cluster in an affluent space, there are still low-income people moving in and out of those spaces constantly, but they are rendered invisible and given less supports because, you know, it's like, well, yeah, if you have a car, if you're on this side of town, you're fine. If not, just wait and see. So those are some ways that I think we could think about the more suburban angle. And let me be clear, I'm talking about poverty. I'm talking about affluence. I'm talking about ethnicity. I'm talking about race. All these factors that we think about inside cities, but we also have to think about in rural spaces. But sometimes the physical space of suburban space and the structures of governance matter, because in a suburban community, arguably, and I talk about this in some of the pieces, you should be able to get local government to respond to you in a more favorable and direct way. You petition a large city, good luck. Everybody does. You petition in a suburb, someone responds. But the story goes, if you're non-white and you petition in the suburbs, maybe someone responds, and it's usually not the thing you asked for fully. Audrey.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. This is a little bit of a random question, but I've been wondering as you've been speaking, if you have any thoughts about some of the controversies that came up with the most recent census and the ways that you're thinking about suburbs and maybe any connections that you have on that topic.
Yeah, not a random question, a complicated one. And it's one that a conversation I'm having with folks who who have deeper knowledge of the census and ACS in particular, right? So the way I'm going to punt is, first, I think our ACS estimates are far better than whatever's going to come out of the census, right? Like, it has richer coverage. We have more data and more information. The census in and of itself is a limited, or the decennial census are limited, right? But what we've actually done in shifting the sample frame has been super helpful. Now, what I'm interested in also, though, is this question even of thinking about measurement. The traditional way in which people define suburbs, for the most part, is take a metropolitan statistical area, right, and subtract the central city. Works, but it doesn't always work, right? There are MSAs that have multiple central cities. There are also plenty of places that are unincorporated. So literally measuring who is there, because part of the suburban story is a story of unincorporated spaces that gets under-examined, right? And so how we measure who is there and knowing what resources are there, sometimes it's about like, all right, is it a census designated place? How do we know if there are adequate resources? We don't have the tools always to measure communities that haven't historically been there and don't have the traditional boundaries that we assume. And that's been one of the challenges that we've had in trying to measure carefully which suburbs are Black suburbs and which spaces get missed by our taxonomy or the limits of our data. And then we have to think about even everything is political. So please don't misread this, but the way in which the 2020 census was politicized in a wholly different manner. I do think no matter which tool you use to estimate, you're still going to find the majority of folks of color, of immigrant, of poor folks now located in spaces outside of the central city. But we have to be very careful and see, well, what kind of spaces are those? What kind of suburbs are those? And there's been a lot of ink spilled around taxonomies. I'm not sure I found one that I love, because in part, a lot of them lean on urban planning, which I think is great. A lot of them lean on kind of like the data that we have, but they don't go back to the earlier studies of suburban inequality in the 20th century, where people were also capturing the social, the relational, the psychosocial, which I think is also part of the tale. Is that helpful?
Very much so. Thank you.
I see Kevin. Is that right?
Hello. Excellent
Hey.
talk.
Thank you.
Excellent talks always. I was just wondering, since you mentioned the physical space and governance area as foreign factors, what role does movement play into this? You already mentioned the fact that in New South, for instance, a lot of Black population are domestic workers, so that's one reason why the idea of containment zone kind of fails. That also applies between communities, like in early mid 20th century, and maybe today. That's kind of outside my area of study. Like, I know that Scarsdale got a lot of domestic workers from Greenberg. So what role do those kind of dynamics play into what you're talking about?
No, you're right. So we think about suburban spaces, and so we talk about bedroom suburbs, and we're like, okay, this is where people live and work and they may commute. Like, there are so many people who cross these lines daily, it would actually baffle us. So when we think about this notion of activity space, even, yeah, there are plenty of folks who only have a certain pattern of where they move, right? So I have my routine, but particularly folks who are wage workers, their activity space tends to look very different in suburban space. Sometimes it's travel via public transit. Sometimes it's crossing over, because you can take the Westchester B across multiple municipalities. It's going to take forever, but that's kind of it. You can also think about the idea of stability of housing and the differences in housing stock, because I may be able to get a well-paying job in Scarsdale, but I can't find housing stock that I can afford in Scarsdale. So now I'm living, sorry, the car is passing by, playing music. Now I'm living in another municipality, commuting and engaging and going back. Like, how do we think about hazard and risk? Like, we don't. Like, we just assume that, yes, because those who have more economic means are able to have more limited patterns of mobility and have very structured movement. We don't often think about that across class and across place. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's very similar to Yonkers, right? So it raises some thoughts about Yonkers. People think about Yonkers as its own city, but it still has had and continues to recruit a large commuter basis in and out of the city, as well as it has some major employers inside of the city that we don't even think about. So like one of the largest gun manufacturers in Yonkers, and they maintain a warehouse and factory. And I'm like, really? So there are all these local ecologies around labor, around movement, around people reside, that I think that the more careful we are, the better our narrative of what happens will be.
Thanks, that's very helpful.
And if I miss a hand, Jacob, you call it out too, because plenty of things I miss. Oh, I see Julia.
Hi, I'm Julia. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was very interesting. I live not so far from New Rochelle, so that was really interesting and upsetting to hear. I was curious, on one of your slides when you were talking about the proportion of Black suburbs increasing, I was wondering what qualified as a Black suburb in your data analysis, if it's just like more than half, or what that came down to.
Great question. So there's two things. Originally, we started with a 25% mark because it's a pretty sizable amount. But we got a review on a paper. It's like, well, what if you chose like a higher mark, like 50%? And so right now we're operating at 50%, but it looks remarkably similar, believe it or not. That heterogeneity that I talked about, nearly identical, right? The percentage goes down a little bit in number, obviously, because it's a higher threshold, but the patterns of difference and non-homogeneity are very present. So right now we're using a cutoff of whether we do 25 or 50, but the graph that I showed was 50. And I prefer 25 to 50 just because there are questions about what it means to be a majority or half, but even at 25%, I think we see these spaces looking different. And I think even as if a space is 25% Black in general population, public schools are usually upward of 35% Black, right? And there are things already there happening. Whereas if it's at 50%, then that means your public school population shifts as well, because I'm particularly interested in education too. Lindsay.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. I have a question actually related to education and specifically school discipline. And I'm curious kind of what you've encountered in your research about school discipline and disproportionality in school discipline. And also an interesting finding that I've come across recently is that the highest disproportionality is actually found in schools where it's much more, there's much more heterogeneity. So in schools where we see maybe like 50% white, 50% students of color, as opposed to schools that are maybe majority students of color or majority white. And I'm curious if that's something that you've noticed and just more broadly what you've noticed about school discipline. Thank you.
Good question. So school discipline, one, in suburban spaces, the disparities remain, right? I think the finding that the more heterogeneous space, yes, but particularly even the more heterogeneous and affluent spaces, right? So in particular, if we think about school discipline not really being as much a function of student behavior, we have tons of evidence that students behaving the same, non-white students, save Asian Americans, get very different treatment, right? Disproportionate treatment, disproportionate kind of punishment, both in school and out of school suspension. Now, part of that relates to, and John Diamond and Amanda Lewis talk about this a good deal in their book, Despite the Best Intentions, like these notions of routine and control, right? What does it mean to exist within the boundaries of the school and this line, and anything that's read as a challenge gets penalized, right? And Prudence Carter had some of this in her work earlier in Yonkers and Keeping It Real. I think the piece, particularly around affluent communities, is also really important because those communities arguably should have more resources to respond differently to infractions but there's usually not an emphasis on training educators or school resource officers around bias and intervention. They'll say in the past, we haven't had an issue, and now literally non-white folks, non-rich folks embody the problem, right? So that long-standing issue that's existed, not just in social sciences, but in the imagination of race in America and the globe, that Du Bois said, how does it feel to be a problem? Because as you show up in these affluent spaces, as you show up in these historically white spaces, you're read as troubling the balance. And there are folks who are pushing back, but oftentimes those communities will say, well, we don't have a discipline problem. The issue is we have a low number of students, so it looks like it's inflated, right? These are the conversations I have with folks. I'm like, yeah, even if you have a small number, don't you think it's concern worthy that those are the students that you suspend? Don't you think it's concern worthy that they tend to come from this housing development or they tend to be renters? And they're like, we're doing pretty well, right? You know, our test scores are high and our students are still going to the best schools. So sometimes it's literally a matter of convincing people to act on their behaviors towards minoritized populations. Sirat, sorry, or Sirut?
Hi, it's Sirat. Thank you. This has been a really enriching conversation. So thank you for everything you've said and all this conversation that's been started. I have a question so about this idea that Black people and people of color in suburban spaces are often seen as invisible. And I feel like I lived in a suburb for a prominent part of my life. And so I also noticed how like, not just that there's this invisible like aspect, but also that like it goes even further to where people don't see also the actions that are being done by people of color to stop political disenfranchisement, et cetera, like their efforts to reform policy as well as like social issues in general. And so my question is, I guess, like, how do we create a culture or undo these misconceptions as well to, instead of like shaming people who live in the South, rather like how do we create a culture to further the discourse that has already been started on reform, I guess.
Yeah, good question. So I think folks of color in the suburbs are both invisible and hyper visible, right? So that is to say, like, people imagine they don't exist, and then when they do see them, they read a lot into their presence and often will act in dramatic ways towards them, right? And so I think about invisibility, hypervisibility, and I think about silenced, right? Which goes back to the idea that sometimes people will say like, oh, I need to speak up for folks who are silent. Like, no one's silent, they've been silenced. The number one way I think we deal with this hypervisibility and invisibility thing is to center the voices of non-white folks in suburban spaces, right? Let's hear what they have to say about the schools, not based on a reputation and a history that relates to who was in the town, based on what's happening now. Let's hear what the community has to say about interactions with the police. Let's hear what they have to say about planning and organization and who should be there, right? Because oftentimes these more affluent niche suburban communities with lower numbers of folks of color have had boards that have a history of not incorporating voices different than their own. Things get passed almost intergenerationally, right? So I'm the commissioner and then I handpick the next and you handpick the next, right? And that chain of passage means that people are allowed to think there's no problem and no issue because they never hear anything different. Most suburban spaces don't even have like an evolved way to collect the voices and experiences. So even in city council meetings and public meetings, they'll do like public commentary or public comment, but there aren't ways where they can strategically collect more insights. Everything from, because if they needed to do it around sanitation, they would, but when it comes to schools, when it comes to police encounters, they don't, right? And so I think there are strategic ways in which folks are silenced, data is not collected, and then hypervisibility and invisibility is used. It also means the folks who are allies, right? Those who are in particular white, who have the ears and eyes of those with greater control. When you are literally invited into the room, say, I'm not going into the room unless there are 2 other folks who come with me, who look differently than I, right? Which is kind of parallel to the university, right? We will find ourselves in spaces where you are the lone voice as a person of color. And I'm like, yeah, I like capped out at that in like 1998, right? From the lone voice, not helpful, right? Because so many times a singular voice is meant to assuage feelings of guilt about a history and a contemporary of practicing racism.
Thank you very much, Luru. We're going to have to end it there. But if everybody can join me in thanking Dr. Lewis-McCoy for a really amazing presentation, and thank you all for your wonderful questions. That was a really great exchange.